So we are on Clubhouse, we are on Instagram Live, we are on Discord, and welcome. All right, so why don't we get going? Looks like Rihan, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, you have a question, so feel free to jump in.
Yeah. The question that I have is, I've been studying a lot about Winston Churchill and kind of like reading a lot about his biographies, and one of the things that I noticed made him incredibly successful was his strong foresight. So I'm just curious as to, have you ever given any thought about, your own foresight? Have you ever conditioned yourself to have better foresight? And if you have, how did you do that? And just kind of anything that you can speak of regarding that. Just curious.
Yeah, what a great question. It's interesting because like foresight is kind of like a vague phenomenon, right? Like I'm sure there's something in the psychological literature that characterizes it. I'm curious if it's even called foresight in the literature. But here's the way that I would answer that question. That's influenced by my own orientation. And what I mean by that is my therapeutic orientation. So if you're a practicing clinical psychologist, you usually kind of have an orientation or school of thought that kind of influences the way that you practice. And I would say, first and foremost, I'm a behaviorist. So I think, that makes us pretty practical in kind of using behavioral sort of therapy. And that includes sort of cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT or acceptance and commitment therapy or what's called ACT. ACT is actually what I train the psychiatry residents in at UCSF Medical School. And it's kind of a values-oriented therapy. And the reason that's sort of relevant to your question is the nice thing about values is that they're qualities that are essentially enduring over a very long period of time. Now, they may sort of adjust and shift as your priorities adjust and shift over time. Let's say, like you're 18, you're in college, your values may be a little bit more self-oriented, right? But obviously, as you move into your 20s, your values may be a little bit more like finding yourself, finding your career. In your 30s and 40s may become more oriented around sort of family and other, right? And maybe in your 40s and 50s, if you have had a successful life, maybe even oriented towards a much greater other in terms of the community. So what's interesting though is, I believe, you probably studied Churchill as much as I have, that folks with a lot of foresight are incredibly values-oriented people. They have an incredible amount of clarity about what their values are, meaning what is actually important to them in life. And that kind of gives them the foresight in order to find their own direction in life and also to handle, the crazy challenges that, face themselves and their countries, right? So, that's what I find to be particularly helpful. And I'll give you a personal example that may be very relevant. So when I was, I believe, a senior at Harvard College, I took a class on the psychology of leadership. And we read a great business book classic called Good to Great. And one of the things that the book was about was talking about what sort of differentiates good, merely good, from truly great, iconic companies that last the test of time. And one of it was they were talking about how the companies are very analogous to values-oriented, mission-oriented. And so they write very clear and definitive mission statements about what is the mission, vision, and values of the company, including big, hairy, audacious goals, or what's called BHAGs, that have a 50% chance of succeeding. And so we actually had to do this as an exercise for our own lives. So literally the assignment was write a mission statement about your own life, one page, and write about what your values are, what are the things that are important to you, some sort of vision about that kind of ties that all together in terms of what you want your life to be about, right? Some big, hairy, audacious goals where if you look forward in 10, 20 years, what would you be proud of having achieved in your life? And then try to write some sort of like a few paragraphs that tie it all together, like some sort of rich, vivid picture of what would your life look like. And it was such a great assignment. It's probably one of my favorite assignments I ever did in college, not because it was difficult, in a technical or academic sense, but because it was weighty. It was like thinking about, man, you're 22 years old, you're on the precipice of starting a new chapter of your life and graduating, and you have to sit there and think very deeply about what is really important to me. How do I prioritize these things? And as I almost have the foresight to think about what I'm going to look like at 25, 30, 35, 40. What would I like my life to be about? And so funnily, I did that exercise. And in a lot of ways, I could not have predicted where I would be, I would say 10 to 15 years later. But that mission statement, it literally is taped to the wall of my bedroom in San Diego. And, I occasionally go back home, obviously, to visit my parents. And I go back and I look at that mission statement and I was like, I had no idea, for instance, I'd be the CEO of a company, right? With Maximus, I had no idea I'd be a clinical professor of psychiatry, or necessarily running a private practice working with CEOs. If you had told me this when I was graduating college, I would have been like, wow, pretty cool, but no clue in terms of having that level of foresight. In terms of specific goals, I think a lot of us are pleasantly, or maybe even sometimes unpleasantly surprised by the direction in which our life turns out. But when I go back and I look at that mission statement, I basically wrote something along the lines of, I would love to start some sort of organization that uses science and is technologically innovative, that supports people's happiness and well-being, and applies that to making people's lives better. Right? That was kind of like the vague mission statement or vision that I had for my life. And looking back upon it now with hindsight, I'm like, I'm pretty much exactly doing that. I didn't know the organization would be a tech startup, and I didn't know sort of health and happiness would be more around sort of health holistically, I would say. But in some form or another, that foresight was exactly true. And it's funny, sometimes I have friends who visit and they're like, you kind of knew what you wanted to do with your life at 22. And I was like, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew the values that were important to me. And in one way or another, I kind of stumbled into doing things that were a reflection of that. It just took on a different form or a different setting than I could have possibly known or anticipated. I think when I was 22, I didn't even know what a tech startup was, right? So that's kind of my advice for you and other folks out there is people are too goal oriented. They're thinking, if I don't know exactly what I want to do with my life in terms of my specific goals, that I'm somehow lost or wandering the desert. I don't think that's the case at all. I think as long as you know what your values are, and the nice thing is values transcend goals, right? The way that I would describe them is a value is a direction, like north. It's your North Star. You always know that you want to be heading in that direction, north. But you might not know the destinations along the way. Goals are destinations. They're like, okay, I'm going to stop here after 5 miles, get some food at the diner, etc. But you're never done heading in a direction. You never reach north, so to speak. And that's the nice thing about values. So an example of that, like if one of my central values that I wrote about in the mission statement is alleviating human suffering, right? It's a very near and dear value to my heart that I saw a lot of suffering in the world when I was at college, both, amongst my classmates and at the world at large. And I was like, I want to do something about that. And it means something to me to do something around that. The good thing is there's many ways of doing that, right? So for instance, in my private practice, I directly work one-on-one to help people alleviate their suffering. When I teach clinicians how to alleviate other people's suffering in terms of doing what I do. And then obviously through the company, by, for instance, having this podcast, and then obviously we're going to have, products and services in the future, we can, alleviate suffering on a much more massive scale, hopefully helping 1 million men be better in mind, body, and masculinity. Now, that's the nice thing is if one of those things work, or two of those three things work, or we stop doing one of those, or we do the third one, there's many ways of fulfilling those values. But if you say my only goal is I have to be a doctor, and that's the only way I can alleviate suffering, and if I don't do that, then my life is a failure, then you could see how precarious sort of being overly goal-oriented is. So that's the nice thing about values, is they give you the flexibility to live out your life in many different ways. If you move to a different country, you might not be able to be a doctor, for instance, and you have to find a different way of alleviating suffering. And so that's what I would say is, just to wrap up and summarize your question, which is a great one, is be crystal clear about what your values are. And hopefully that will give you both the foresight, but also the flexibility to kind of adjust your life course, as you deal with, new things that you can't even possibly anticipate in the future. I'm not sure how much Winston Churchill, for instance, anticipated all, the wartime situation and all the calamities and challenges that would arise. But I think he did have a true north in terms of what he wanted for himself, what he wanted obviously for Great Britain, and that was able to give him both the fortitude and the direction to continue and persist.
Yeah, I really appreciate you answering that. I think you're incredibly right when you say Winston Churchill didn't really have goals, but he had an incredibly strong set of values that guided his decision making, and I think also contributed to his foresight. So yeah, super interesting. Thanks for answering.
For sure. So we got our user Alp on the Discord. Do you want to chime in with your question?
Yeah, sure thing. Ken, what are your thoughts on dream interpretation and any recommendations on getting better at it?
The question was around dream interpretation?
Yes.
Did you have a interesting dream you'd like to share recently?
None that come to mind, but I recently started a dream journal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm getting better at remembering my dreams.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wanted to see if I can make some meaning out of it, because some of my dreams are relatively absurd.
Yeah, dreams certainly can be absurd and maybe even surrealistic in a lot of ways. And there's some fun and interesting things you can do with your neurochemistry, by the way. If you experiment with melatonin or glycine or galantamine, these are over-the-counter supplements that actually sometimes people take on purpose to increase the vividness of their dreams. And some people try to take it in order to achieve what it's called lucid dreaming, in which you're consciously awake. Well, I shouldn't say consciously awake. You're aware, I should say, during your dreams so that you can control them. If you're ever interested, by the way, in that subject, there's a colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen LeBerge, wrote a book called Ewald, Exploring the World of Lucid Dreaming, where he teaches people how to do that, not only with supplements, but through behavioral techniques like reality checks. So that aside, the question about dream interpretation is an interesting one. There's obviously a lot of anecdotes about what do our dreams mean. The challenge is that it depends on kind of your school of thought. To the previous caller's question, different schools of psychology, and I would even say different cultures, have different ways of interpreting dreams. In the American tradition, I would say it's the psychoanalytic school, right? So if you think of kind of like the Freudian and Jungian school, they have their whole shtick around, dream interpretation and how to interpret symbols and metaphors in your dreams. So if you want to kind of explore it in that way, there's lots of great books on dream interpretation. You can find that, if you're, let's say, remembering your dreams with your dream journal, which by the way is a great technique. And this is true, by the way, for everyone, even if you don't want to get into dream interpretation. A lot of people say, I don't dream. That's actually factually incorrect. Everyone dreams. If you're having REM sleep, which as long as you have normal, what's called sleep architecture, you're going through the normal phases of sleep, you definitely dream. What happens to most people, including myself, is, you're getting up really suddenly in the morning, you're probably rushed, and so you don't remember your dreams because they fade very quickly, right? But if you sit there immediately after you wake up and you ask yourself, what did I just dream about? And you almost force yourself to kind of consciously recall it and go through it step by step, whether just kind of in your head or ideally writing it down in a dream journal, it'll actually increase your dream recollection. So once you do that, you can better obviously remember what you dreamed about. You can write down any interesting symbols that you had, and then you can almost look it up like in a dictionary in sort of the dream interpretation book, what these symbols mean. Now, is that empirical or scientific in terms of the interpretation of symbols? Maybe not. I think those are sort of less empirical, schools of psychology. But I think the Jungian sort of perspective is that we have what's called a collective unconscious, right? So I'll tell you a little story to answer your question. So Jung was actually a very by the book, at least early in his career, psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, had a private practice kind of focusing on schizophrenia. And he started noticing that sort of in between patients, he would like drift off into these sort of reveries, whether they were naps or sort of daydreams, if you will. And he would have these very rich visions. And so just like you, he would actually write them down in a journal, which was a red book, literally, that he would kind of keep. And he started noticing that he would see symbols, right? And he would write them down. He'd even illustrate them. He was actually a very talented author as well. But for instance, you'd notice things like crosses and snakes in trees and things that, some of which, like beetles and stuff, he had never been exposed to before. But when he would look it up, he would notice, like, for instance, in Egyptian art or mythology, they would use a lot of these scarabs or beetles as part of their iconography and mythology. And so he's like, how did I sort of randomly dream about things that I've never been exposed to before? It must be because there's sort of a collective unconscious that society sort of shares, and that we almost like can tap into and maybe are even exposed to when we dream. And so that's their idea of why does this symbol, like the snake, mean temptation, for instance, which is a very Christian biblical allegorical symbol. And according to the Jungians, it's around sort of this collective unconscious. So if you want to do that, whether it's sort of you treat it as empirical, you treat it as entertainment, I think that's kind of fun and interesting to do. I don't sort of practice that school of psychology, so I don't do dream interpretation, quite frankly, with any of my patients. But I do think it is, a reflection of your unconscious mind, right? Because you're literally unconscious, obviously, when you're dreaming. And so, some of the dreams are maybe sort of meaningless, and maybe the mind's, attempt to sort of process what's going on in the day and consolidate memory. But obviously there are some dreams that are almost obviously meaningful. That is the way that I would say. You don't have to interpret it in some like tarot card kind of way where, a lot of people obviously dream about what happened during the day or people in their lives. And they might be having a fight, let's say, with their significant other, in their dream. And it doesn't take a psychologist to realize maybe you have some unresolved tension with that person, right? And in your brain, you're kind of trying to hash it out and deal with that. And that may suggest to you that in real life, okay, there needs to be some work done there. Maybe I need to have a conversation with this person because there's still animosity that's lingering and carrying forward in my dreams. So I'll give you a really interesting cross-cultural anecdote to that. There's a wonderful book. It's actually out of print. It's called Pygmies and Dream Giants by Kilton Stewart. He's a neuropsychologist back in the day who wrote this kind of fantastical, I don't even know if it's semi-fictional or not, but it's supposed to be an autobiography based on his real experiences of visiting the Philippines and visiting sort of the indigenous people there, the tribal people there, who took their dreams very seriously, right? So for instance, a whole family, they'd wake up in their little hut or whatnot, and the first thing they would do is they would share their dreams. The mother, father, and the child would be like, okay, what did you dream about? So instead of a dream journal, it was almost like an oral family tradition of a dream journal. And so they would remember all of their dreams because it was very important. And let's say the son said, I imagined in my dream last night that I had a fight with one of the neighbor's kids that I've been playing with. And I in my dream, I beat the kid up, right? The mother and the father, because they actually take their dreams very literally, said, you got to go over to that kid and apologize in real life for what you did in that dream. That's how seriously they would sort of take the dream. Now, that's such an interesting thing. It comes from a very different sort of cultural tradition. But, some folks sort of take dreams literally, right? From, other sort of traditions. I think it's up to you how sort of literal, metaphorical, or if you take them into account at all. But I would say if there's obvious kind of signs that, hey, maybe there's some unresolved issues that I have with some people, or it's telling me something, then it is a clue, right? So that's the way that I would kind of think about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken.
Sure thing.
That's helpful.
All right. Other folks with questions?
So here's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're not trying to get as big as you possibly can. What's like your reasonable bench, deadlift, and squat? It's just like, this is a minimum bar. You're not going to go any further. You're going to move on to other things. Like for like, mobility, I don't know, picking things up, just purely functional stuff? What's like a solid stopping point?
Are you talking about in terms of strength standards?
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, and when you say you're not trying to get big, you mean like physically, your physical size and muscular development or hypertrophy.
Got it. Yeah, let me make the question more concrete. Let's say, a lot of people, when they lift, right, they try to get as big as they possibly can.
Yep.
Over a period of 10 years.
Sure.
And let's say your goal is just to be strong enough for self-defense or something. So what's a solid stopping point, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it is depends on your goals. By the way, I don't think, by the way, hypertrophy or getting big is inherently a negative goal, even if you're not a bodybuilder. I think it's actually worth talking about because, unfortunately, I think the bodybuilding community is like ruined muscular development and aesthetics for most people, especially women, actually, right? When you talk to so many women, there's this incredible myth that's perpetuated that I don't want to lift weights because I don't want to get too big, right? And I always have to talk to my female friends about how that's basically impossible for them. For most people, I would say. I'm sure there's some freak exceptions with myostatin gene abnormalities, but that's like 1 in a million, literally. But the problem is they see these bodybuilders that are humongous, right? And they think that they're going to the gym, they're gonna look anything like that. Even guys can't honestly get that big. You can pretty much visually almost tell when someone is pharmacologically enhancing their testosterone because there's kind of natural limits, quite frankly, to how big one can get. And I would pretty much say, I think this is true for, I would guess, 99% of people. If you are natural, you will not get too big. It's basically impossible. It takes so much hard work for a guy to get big, meaning like lifting weights every single day for decades. And at that point, I would say you look pretty good. You look aesthetic. You're not going to look too big, with very rare exception. So the whole big phobia, I would say, that people have is pretty much, unless again you're purposely trying to get huge, with pharmacological enhancement, is basically impossible. Now, even if your goal aesthetically is not to get huge, which, by the way, I would say guys have more of a preoccupation with size than women do. As long as you're not like fat and have a dad bod, I think guys, there's been research on this. Guys think that the ideal body type is bigger than if you ask women. Women are like, they want someone who's slightly muscular, but guys that think that they need to be like super jacked to have like the ideal sort of Adonis or Greek ideal. So you don't actually have to be that big. But I actually think for health reasons, it is actually very useful to quite frankly, in my opinion, is you should actually try to put on as much muscle as you can when you can. And the reason is, it's easier when you're younger. Your levels of testosterone and growth hormone are optimal when you're young, and they will slowly fade over time. Not always. If you can particularly stave off excess body fat, you can actually maintain high testosterone levels, I would say actually, well into your 50s and 60s. Certainly there's a lot of ex-Olympic athletes that still in their retirement age have higher testosterone levels than young men today. There's maybe some other environmental reasons and pollutants for that. But what I would say is, the biggest actually issue with getting old, if you're talking about being over 65, is frailty, right? You become really weak, you become frail. You can kind of imagine the sort of stereotype of an old man or old woman that's sort of hunched over, right? And they're starting to develop osteoporosis, and they're frail in terms of, they'll likely fall, they can't sort of get up, they break their hip, and then, they end up in a wheelchair. They end up in sort of a, senior care kind of setting. You want to obviously avoid that. And one of the best ways of avoiding that is actually to put on as much muscle as possible. Like I said, you're not going to get too big. That's pretty much impossible, even in your 20s and 30s, if you're sort of natural. But the idea is you're going to slowly also lose that muscle mass over time. And so if you have a healthy, not even extra amount, but just a healthy amount of muscle when you're younger, it's almost like reserves for the winter, right? Like, you know how like the squirrels are sort of saving extra nuts, knowing that there's going to be times of starvation, they might not be able to eat. That's almost like the purpose of body fat, right? The human body likes to accumulate body fat very easily. That's why 70% of people are overweight or obese, because they know, at least in our ancestral times, there may be times where there isn't food and you can literally live off of your body fat. There's in fact been really, really interesting studies where they have someone essentially fast, as long as they're getting enough water and supplements, for a year if they're obese. Like say it's a 400-pound guy. A 400-pound guy does not need to literally eat for a year. It's kind of mind-blowing because he can literally burn his body fat as fuel. And the human body was almost designed that way, to essentially use your fat stores as a reserve in times of scarcity. My parallel thesis is muscle should almost be treated the same way, where you want to put on as much muscle as possible because you're slowly going to lose it, especially into your old age. And so if you have a decent amount of muscle, especially I would say as a guy in your 50s and 60s, you can maintain an incredibly high level of quality of life in terms of physical health, sexual health, vibrancy and vitality, if you kind of maintain that. But it's much easier to put it on and maintain it than it is to try to, you're kind of a skinny, frail 65-year-old. Yes, you can still put on muscle at any age, but it's much easier to maintain muscle mass than it is to put it on. And I'll give you some interesting, actually scientific data on this. Realistically, once you get over initial weightlifting, what I mean by that is if you're sort of a naive weightlifter, you can put on 10, 15 pounds of muscle in the first year. That's because your body's never been exposed to that stimulus. But once you become sort of more of an intermediate weightlifter, you've kind of got over those newbie gains, as sort of people in the bro science like to say. Realistically, you really can't put on more than half a pound a month, I would say, maybe a pound a month, and that's like super optimal. Like realistically, six pounds a year of muscle, it would be an incredible amount of gains for someone who's, I would even say like maybe 12 pounds if you're intermediate, 6 pounds if you're advanced, which is hard to do, right? And you have to be lifting, I would say, at least 3 times a week, maybe up to 5 times a week, really putting in a ton of effort. In order to gain that amount of muscle. And realistically, if you're older and maybe your hormone levels are not as optimal, you'd be lucky to put on, let's say, 3 pounds a year. And that's over the course of an entire year. On the other hand, if you're just talking about maintaining muscle mass, there's research that shows that you only need to lift once a week, maybe even once every 2 weeks, in order to just maintain what you have in terms of muscle mass and strength. So, that's an incredibly lower bar than 3 to 5 times a week to gain muscle. You only have to do it every 7 to 14 days to maintain it, right? So it's much more advantageous. So it's kind of almost like a rich and fun metaphor for life, in that when you're young, you want to invest and put in the hard work to get, put on muscle mass, because then you can almost sort of coast for the rest of your life and just try to maintain it in your 60s, 70s, and 80s. Some of you'll naturally lose, but you can at least adjust the trajectory of the slope so you're not losing it as quickly, where maybe if you're only losing half a pound of muscle, maybe a pound of muscle a year, even as you're losing it, if you put on 5 extra pounds of also reserves, just like body fat, like I was talking about, you're still going to look good, feel good, and perform good into your old age. So I share all that in kind of encouraging both men and women to put on some extra muscle, quite frankly, when you're younger, because it's going to be helpful as you get old in order to avoid frailty. Now, all that being said, let me answer your question about sort of strength standards. There are other reasons, of course, to lift weights, and that has to do with sort of functional benefits that go beyond hypertrophy or muscle gain, which includes strength and athletic performance, right? So as you mentioned, one of the reasons someone might lift weights is because they want to be better at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They want to hit more home runs if they're playing baseball, etc. So there's 2 things I would say is if you're doing it for a sport-specific reason, you want to do sport-specific training, right? Now, there are sort of, probably every athlete benefits from doing compound lifts, meaning squats, deadlifts, bench, press. These are sort of whole body movements, and it's generally useful. But, for instance, if someone's swinging a golf club or a baseball, There may be some specific sort of rotating kind of motions that they want to do with a cable machine that, the average Joe may not need to do. So that's one thing I would actually say is, in addition to the compound lifts, you may want to think about things that might help your grappling, for instance, or work with someone who does sort of strength and physical conditioning for people in your individual sport, whether that's BJJ or otherwise, because that will be very helpful. There are a bunch of strength standards. You can look those up online. The problem with them is it depends on what you're going for, right? There's sort of general standards that like they'll say for a man, this is what a beginner, this is what an intermediate, this is what a advanced person should have, and it just depends. I don't think it's a one size fits all. I mean, I think if you're just talking about for the general population, I would say it's a good goal to be able to bench your body weight. Let's say if you can do 1x your body weight, that's a relatively fit person, right? So you're talking about 175 pound male on average. If you can bench 175 pounds, that's pretty strong. If you can do about 1.5x your body weight, so let's say a person's 150 pounds, if they can bench 225, which is 2 plates on each side, that's pretty strong actually. And obviously it would be a little bit heavier if you're a little bit of a bigger male, maybe closer to 245. That's more, I would say, a pretty fit, pretty strong male. So I would say 1 to 1.5x on bench is a pretty good benchmark. Of course, if you're talking about elite powerlifter territory, then yes, of course, like going closer to 2x your body weight, that's pretty amazing. But then that's so rare. We're talking like less than 5% of guys can do that. It's more in the elite athlete territory. And also, I'm not sure it has huge functional benefits. If you even look at professional athletes, what they're doing in terms of the NFL Combine, they're seeing how much they can bench in terms of how many reps of 225 they can do. And these are like 350-pound linebackers, right? They're not testing their 1 rep max PR. They're just saying, okay, this is the same weight that everyone does. So there's not always a benefit to, I would say, trying to lift as heavy as possible. And in fact, there's a lot of injury potential if you're trying to lift as heavy as possible and doing one rep PRs if you're not competing or doing powerlifting. So that's a useful rule of thumb. For squats, I would say in that case, 1.5x for the general population is sort of useful. Like I said, so if you're, let's say, a 150-pound male, like 225 would be a good sort of strength benchmark. And I would say 2x body weight would be a useful benchmark. So in that case, if you can squat 300 pounds, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Deadlift, I would say, is pretty comparable to squat. Similar strength standards. You can probably deadlift more than you squat, technically speaking. But I actually, this is my personal opinion, like to actually keep the strength standard of deadlift and squat the same, because the risk of injury if you don't have proper form of squatting can be high. And so, I think people who are pushing and trying to get 2.5x their body weight or 3x their body weight on deadlift, sure, you can do it, but you may harm yourself if you're not sort of doing it properly. And then, if you're just talking about a military press, it's even lower. I don't think there's a lot of people who can even do 1x their body weight. That would be a good sort of elite athlete strength standard, but for most people, if you do about 0.75% or x your body weight, that would be a pretty solid press, I would say. So, I think the thing is, I don't take these too literally. They're rules of thumb. I think guys inherently have a competitive capacity, so they always want to see where they measure up compared to other guys, and it's fun and it's useful. But the reality is, like I said, if your focus is a little bit more on hypertrophy, if you're looking good and you're building muscle, does it matter how much you can bench? Nobody cares, right? I actually very early in my weightlifting career never benched at all. I would do butterflies, or I'd do cables, and I had really great pectoral development, right? You can, if you see my Instagram pictures and stuff, without ever having a bench. And it's the same thing if you talk to Jay Cutler, who I believe was Mr. Olympia. one of the biggest dudes in the world at the time, obviously pharmacologically enhanced, but they asked him, how much can you bench? And he was like, I have no clue, because I don't care. I'm doing like 10 sets of 10 reps on the bench of whatever it was, the weight was. But he's like, I'm just doing volume because that's what makes me big. I don't care about setting some record. I'm not a power lifter. I'm a bodybuilder. So that's what I would say too, is unless you're trying to set records or do more of a powerlifting where the amount of the weight matters, for the average person, other than kind of just seeing where you are in the hierarchy of, the athletic pantheon, I would focus a lot more on, lifting in a way that keeps you healthy, that keeps you injury free, that puts on as much muscle mass as possible, and gives you the edge that you need in doing your sport. So it's fun to run the numbers and compare where you are, but I would focus more on those things. I think it's probably more useful.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Absolutely. It looks like we got a question from Aritra. The question is it possible to build muscle at home? Do you want to actually ask the question yourself if you're on the line? So I'm not reading it.
Yeah. Is it possible to build muscle at home, possibly with some dumbbells without a complete gym setup? And if yes, could you give some tips? Like with the gyms being closed and...
Yes, absolutely it is possible. And there's lots of folks who have. The thing is, we have this association with obviously weightlifting as being the only way to build muscle. It's probably the best way, I would say, just because it allows the most adjustment, right? You can pick up a 5-pound weight, you can pick up a 50-pound weight, and no matter where you are starting, you can adjust along the way. But really, if you're going into the physiology of it, what you need is resistance, right? You don't even necessarily need weight. And there's lots of ways of providing resistance. It can be through lifting a weight. It can be through lifting your own body weight, or it can be some other form of resistance, like using a band, for instance. So whether you're sort of using gravity as a resistance, internally, externally, in terms of your body or weight or a band, that's the important thing. And then, there's another principle that's called time under tension, right? So the stimulus that's applied to the muscle, the critical thing is how much resistance are you applying to the muscle, and how much time is it staying under tension, right? Because as you're lifting the weight or you're lifting yourself up, you're putting the muscle to work under tension. And so that's the critical thing. So you don't necessarily need weights at all. I think I mentioned this probably in the last show. A buddy of mine, Jerry Texera, has a YouTube channel that's all body weight stuff. You don't even necessarily need any equipment, or very minimal equipment, I would say. Ideally, I would say, like for most folks, if they can set up a pull-up bar at home or find somewhere, that'll get you a long way, quite honestly. That and doing some body weight stuff. And this guy is totally jacked. So you can definitely put on a ton of muscle by doing that. If you do have some dumbbells at home, you can absolutely benefit as well. I'd say it gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of what you can do. There are certain things that are harder to work out with body weight. You can do a body weight for, let's say, bicep stuff. It's easier if you have a pull-up bar. Obviously, if you have dumbbells, it makes it easier to work out your biceps. So what I would say, though, the tricky thing is, are your dumbbells adjustable? Do you have like a wide set, or you just have like one pair?
I have a couple of them, but it's not adjustable.
Okay. What's like the weight range of them?
I have some 20s, and I have 140, and 110, I mean, a couple of 10s.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty decent range. If you're talking about 10s to 40s, for an average person of average fitness and strength, you can pretty much do everything that you need to do. Because there's some exercises that, like if you're sort of doing let's say a bent over reverse fly, right? Where you're standing, you're kind of hunching over and you're lifting the weight, the opposite as you would sort of a butterfly. That probably, for most folks, 10 pounds is enough resistance to kind of work the back of your deltoids or your shoulders. Now, 10 pounds might not be enough to work your biceps, right? If you're a little bit stronger. So you might want to use, the 20s to sit down and do some curls in that case. Or let's say you're trying to do kind of a reverse tricep extension where you're kind of putting it behind your head and lifting it up. If you have your 140, as you mentioned, you can use that because that'll provide enough resistance. So what I would do is, basically adjust the weight to the difficulty of the exercise. And basically what is optimal for hypertrophy, there's a ton of literature and debate on this, but I would say, the bros were probably right in going for the whole 3 sets of 10 reps is a useful rule of thumb. I would generally say if you find something where you're doing it in between the 8 to 12 rep range, and that's allowing you to hit kind of muscular fatigue, meaning you can't do an additional set, that's usually a good rule of thumb that you're using the right amount of weight, right? Now, the reality is it can probably be a wider range. I would say anywhere even between 5 and 15 reps is a good rule of thumb. If you're doing closer to the 5 reps, it'll help kind of build more strength. If you're building, towards more 15 reps, you're building a little bit more muscular endurance. As long as you're doing it within that rep range, that should be enough to both build strength and build muscle. Now, the challenge is if you only have basically 3 different weights, how do you make sure that, given the enormous variety of exercises, you are falling within that range? And that's where you can use the timing to your advantage. So let's say you're actually pretty strong, right? And you have your 20-pound dumbbells and you're doing bicep curls. And let's say if you just did normal curls, you could probably do 20 reps before you get tired, right? And you can't do another rep. So you're starting to get a little bit more like into the endurance range, and it's not optimal for hypertrophy. One way of addressing that is you can just slow down, right? We actually know from the research literature that the eccentric component, which is when you're lowering the weight against gravity, is actually more important to strength development and muscular development than the concentric portion when you're lifting the weight up. So for instance, instead of just doing 20 curls before you get tired, what I would suggest is you go up really quickly, the concentric portion, you do that in about a second, and then you lower the eccentric portion really slowly, right? So count kind of out loud or in your head slowly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you're lowering it slowly, which is obviously very difficult because you're kind of fighting gravity. And if you do it that way, you'll find that you can't do 20 reps. Maybe you can only do 10 reps because taking the slower eccentric component is obviously much harder than just quickly pumping it up and down, right? So that's an example of sort of using timing to almost make the weight heavier, so to speak, and keep it closer to that 5 to 15, optimally 8 to 12 rep range. So you can definitely use that to your advantage, even if you don't have all the equipment in the world. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is you can use your rest periods to your advantage. Where let's say if you were in a normal gym, you might want to take a minute or 2 between sets to recover fully. But if you're using sort of lighter weights, you can take, let's say, a 30-second break between sets, which, if you're normally doing, let's say, 20 reps on the first set with a 30-second break, you could only do 15 on the second set. Take a 30-second break, you can only do 10 on the third set. So that second and third set falls back into that optimal range, that I mentioned. Third technique you can do is something called supersetting, right? Which is, let's say you're starting out with a 40-pound weight. And again, let's use the curls as the example. Maybe you can only do 3 reps on the curls at 40 pounds. Great. Do them and then stop at the point in which you're ruining your form. You never want to lift weights and be swinging the weights or doing something that's going to hurt yourself. So go do as many reps as you can safely do with perfect form. Drop the weight to 20. And then you may be able to bang out, let's say, an additional, 7 to 10 reps with the 20-pound weight. And then without taking a break, you're like, okay, now I'm tired again. Let's eke out 5 to 10 more with that 10-pound weight that I have. And so that's a great example of a superset where you start out heavy, then you go to medium, then you go to light, and you're kind of actually doing the whole range, focusing on sort of strength and then shifting to endurance. And it really tires and burns the muscles when you do that. So it's tiring. You may not want to do that all the time every day. Or if you do that, maybe one set of that is sufficient instead of the 3 sets that I mentioned in terms of doing a standard 3x10. So that these are nice ways of essentially giving yourself flexibility and adjustment, that even if you only have 3 different classes of weights, you can still do a lot. Finally, the last thing that I would say is kind of listen to your body. I actually was going to write a whole article about this, that one of the best techniques that's helpful is it's useful to understand these rep ranges when you start out as a weightlifter, because there's, like I said, you want to lift heavy enough that it's causing enough sort of resistance so that you're getting stronger and building muscle, but not so heavy that you're having shitty form and you're injuring yourself, right? Over time, though, as you become experienced as a lifter, you realize that rep ranges are limiting. A lot of guys literally do 10 reps every single time with every single exercise, and they're not maxing out their potential, right? In reality, you could have done maybe an 11th or a 12th rep. So sometimes it's useful to just listen to your body and say, I'm going to shoot for this kind of 5 to 15 range, but I'm going to sit there and just listen to how my body feels. And when I'm getting pretty close to sort of muscular fatigue, that's when I'll stop. It could be at 8, it could be at 12, or it could be at 10. But giving yourself a little bit more flexibility in terms of listening to how your body feels in that moment gives you more flexibility. It also may change on a day-to-day basis. Maybe on a day where you're tired, you can only do 8 curls. Maybe on a day when you have more energy, you can do 12. So you want to obviously adjust to how your body's feeling and what capability it has that day.
Yeah, that was super helpful. Yeah, especially because I was seeing the benefits plateauing over time. So yeah, the 3 tips were definitely very, very helpful. Thanks.
Absolutely.
If no one else is jumping in right away, I have a question for you, Cam. To do with the mind-body connection. And I know in our accountability groups, we're focusing a lot on sleep, nutrition, exercise, and dopamine fasting. How important is the actual mind-body connection when we're talking about like working out and building muscle mass? Like how should we look at the mindset when we approach the physical body?
Yeah, I think the mind-body connection is tremendously important and underappreciated, I would say. So I'll give 2 interesting examples from one of the godfathers of bodybuilding, which is Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you actually read his, I think he has like a Bible to bodybuilding, or a book that he kind of put out, and he actually talks about this. And I think it's honestly one of the secrets to his success is the problem that I see with a lot of folks who are lifting is now there's so much distraction, music, digital distraction in the gym, right? Back in the days, a lot of these places, including Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, which is where the mecca of bodybuilding is, that Arnold and other folks from the golden era, so to speak, of bodybuilding used to work out in, it was sparse. It was like heavy weights, a bunch of iron and a bunch of giant dudes lifting weights. It wasn't this very like equinoxy experience where everyone is like plugged in to their AirPods and very disconnected. There's nothing wrong with listening to music, but I think sometimes people are so not present when they're lifting weights because they're listening to music. They're often maybe even listening to a podcast. There's nothing sort of wrong with that, but you don't want to do it to where your attention is not on your body, right? So when Arnold would talk about lifting weights, he would actually talk about putting his attention on the muscle, right? And so when you're doing, let's say, curls, he'd be focused on the bicep. His attention would be placed on the bicep. How does my bicep feel, right? And when I'm lifting it, I'm noticing how tired it's getting. I'm noticing the pump that I'm getting as I'm lifting it up and down. And I'm really trying to focus on that and actually encourage it and strengthen the mind-body connection. And this is what I was talking about. Sometimes if we're just focused on reps and, okay, I'm going to do my 10 reps, you're going to sit there and in your head just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and I'm going to drop it. There's not a lot of thought to that. Versus if you're actually lifting to the point of getting to fatigue, it almost forces you to be mindful and say, I have to pay attention to how my muscle feels and that's when I'm going to stop, right? And so it almost like makes you be a little bit more present. And that's what I would encourage you, is whether or not you're listening to music or a podcast, it should be kind of in the background rather than the foreground. In the foreground, your attention should be placed on the muscle that you're trying to work, and you should be feeling the contraction. You should be noticing how tired you're getting, so that obviously you stop at the point in which, you know, your form is getting off, and you're trying to get that pump. And when you do that, it enhances the mind-body connection. And there's a second example that I wanted to share too, is there's interesting research that if you only lift weights on one side of your body, right? Let's say I only do curls on my left side, right? I literally leave my right side alone because let's say I broke my arm and it's in a cast. Your right bicep will still grow. This is fascinating. And there's two reasons for it. One, there's a hormonal reason, which is when you lift weights, even if you're targeting the left side only, you're still, the testosterone and the growth hormone and other factors are surging through your veins, and so it's still affecting the right side of your body too, even if you're not doing work, so to speak. But then the second part of it is actually this neuromuscular connection, which is when you're lifting weights on the left side, your body, because of its sort of parallel symmetry, is almost through the sort of mind-body connection, is almost lifting weights, even if it's not lifting weights on the right side. And so your right bicep will still grow. Now, of course, it won't grow as much as the left, which is doing the actual work, but it actually does do the work as well. So it kind of illustrates, which is kind of fascinating, that just literally thinking about lifting weights can actually make your muscles grow. Just literally posing in front of a mirror. This is actually why a lot of bodybuilders, they're posing in order to prepare for a bodybuilding show, but it actually also enhances the mind-body connection. When you're sitting there and flexing in front of a mirror, pumping up your biceps, getting the engorgement, knowing when to flex, when to contract, it all enhances that mind-body connection. So I would encourage folks when they're lifting weights to kind of use that tip from Arnold, really focus your attention on the muscle being worked to enhance and strengthen that mind-body connection, which is really critical.
Fantastic. Thank you.